So now we're going to talk about another way of describing photographs. We're going to talk about static composition and dynamic composition. So, and the components of each, and why you might want to use one or the other. I'd like to say this now, and I'll say it a bunch more times. One is not better than the other. There are times when a static composition is demanded. There are times when a dynamic composition is demanded. It depends on what you're trying to say. It depends on what the image is doing, what's it being used for, what's its intent, what it's supposed to communicate. So one's not better than the other. So let's start with static composition. It has a lot of vertical and horizontal lines that are parallel with the edge of the frame. The center of interest is in the center of the photograph. And all those things help to create a more predictable or peaceful or resting kind of composition. Something that's held very tightly. Right? Something that's predictable. Fort Point in San Francisco, frame within a frame within a frame, centered, right? It's static, it's not moving. There's not a lot of drama to the image. It's contained within all these lines that are somewhat parallel to the frame. Not exactly, but some. Be careful of this symmetrical balance or mirror image. That could be done by cutting the photograph exactly in half, but it's also this idea of this reflection thing. So in this case, the line of the water on the boat, or where the reflection begins and the real boat ends, is about the center of the frame. So really, what's more important, the actual boat or the reflection of the boat? Cut in half, we really don't know. It's tempting though, right? You go out in nature, you're going for a walk, you see this beautiful still lake, pond, you see all this shrubbery, you see this perfect mirror image, you don't even know where the horizon line is, it looks like a kaleidoscope or something, you know? What do you do with it? I don't know, maybe you turn it horizontally, and then it looks really, really weird. But you have to be careful of these, because once the gag is over in that instant, and then people figure it out, they're kind of ready to move on, right? Because it's been done, it's been seen. Okay, so you have to be a little bit careful of that. One thing that static compositions can be good for is to be very formal, to show dignity, power, trustworthiness, very conventional, all those kind of words. Now, I won't ask you on the final exam, static composition emphasizes what? Or static composition means this. And the answer would be formality, dignity, or conventionality. No, I'm not going to ask that question. You could use other words. These are examples of when you see an image that is static. You could say, wow, that looks really formal, because everything is in its place. It's very organized. It's very stable. Right? It's got some power, but it's very formal and predictable. And sometimes that's good. The classic corporate headshot. The end of my time at Xerox, people were getting a little bit more loose with their interpretation of a headshot. But the most of the time they wanted to look like everybody else, which was just the standard head and shoulders, not a huge smile, but a little smile, and then off to the printer. This may be a little bit less formal, but still, kind of centered. Not a lot of diagonals. The light's not crazy. But it's a little close, right, to fall into that predictable. But it's on the edge. Central compositions, again, be careful. They might be too literal, static, monotonous, but they almost suggest stability and rest. As I said, center something. It's predictable. It's stable. You can trust it. It's peaceful. Those are the kind of words you can start associating with when you see an image. How does it make you feel? It makes me feel calm. Makes me feel relaxed. Makes me feel confident, taken care of. Those are the kind of things we start talking about when we talk about how pictures affect the viewer. Remember, you guys, photography isn't a one-person activity where you go and shoot pictures, you look at them on your screen, and you square them away on the hard drive for nobody ever to see them. That's not why we make photographs. That's not why we're photographers. We make pictures to show people, to move people, to make them feel something, to motivate them, call them to action, something, explain something to them. So these are the words we're going to start attaching to these photographs and then understand what it is that's causing them. So maybe this is a nice central composition. It might be peaceful for a bunch of reasons, the color tone, the light, that kind of thing. But it is a more relaxing photograph. It's not necessarily dynamic. It's not edgy, none of those kind of things. You can also think about composing vertically, and maybe even looking up a little bit to make something look bigger. Give it some more power or dignity by looking up at somebody. This is a big trick we play on executives. You don't want to look down on them with a photograph. You want to look up a little bit, so it's clear that they're taller and bigger than you. Okay? This isn't an executive, but you can see what happens when you start looking up at somebody, as well as being, a little bit more power, a little bit more dignity, that kind of stuff. You got to be careful because those things that are closer to the camera get larger. Those things further away get small. The legs and feet are closer to the camera. They're very large compared to her head. She's probably a very well-proportioned young lady. And in fact, this picture distorts that a little. Imagine if she had a big belly, how that would look. Imagine if she had big thunder thighs, how would that look? Right? If those were close to the photograph and her head was far away. So keep that in mind, how far you go with pushing these different unique angles. So also horizontally suggests peace, rest, tranquility. I don't know about this, but what I figured is that we're probably more used to seeing an image horizontally than we are vertically. Our computer screens are landscape or horizontal. Movie screens, landscape or horizontal. Television screens, landscape or horizontal. It's expected. It's how we see the world. Vertical changes that. So this would be a little bit more comfortable if it was a horizontal versus a vertical. So think about that when you're composing your pictures. So what about dynamic composition? Dynamic sounds better, but sometimes it's not. Think about dynamic composition as having the eye bolt around the photograph. Making a photograph with diagonals, tilting the camera, making the horizon line not level, converging lines, center of interest placed somewhere odd, not in the center of the photograph, to call attention to itself. That begins to shake the viewer up a little bit or change things. So think about that if you want to draw attention to the photograph. You want to make it a little bit more edgy. You want to make it a little bit more uncomfortable. These lines converging to the top of that cave, big black hole up there. You're there, sort of first-person view. You're going to climb up this ladder and dive into this big hole, never to be seen again. Not calm. These little needles, and they're pointy and they're going every which way, sends your eye and a bouncing around the picture where it can't stop. There's a softness of the water in the leaves, but the power and the contrast of the needles in the black water give it that movement, give it that jumping around kind of feel to it. Again, no soft edges. They're all pointy. Because it's glass, we assume it's sharp. We assume it can cut you. So we have a little bit of a reaction to that. The places where it overlaps, there's a nice tonal change, and then contrasted with what's beyond it, which is completely black. So this falls into that more dynamic category, a little bit more edge to the photograph. Excuse the pun. For dynamic compositions, we may not want to be symmetrical in our balance. We may want to balance it completely off to really create an instability to the image. I don't really have too many examples of that. Action or motion can be another way that we achieve dynamic composition. This is where you can do some panning of the camera. Maybe they're not running straight across. Maybe they're running at an angle towards the camera, away from the camera. Right? But getting some motion involved to the image begins to make it a little bit more dramatic. Again, here this comes up again, where the drama in the picture, the speed, the intensity. So these diagonal lines can also, be a little bit not so calming. They can be motion, or they can be a little bit more competing with each other or conflicting with each other. So you have the smoothness of the water, the waterfall, the gentleness of the water, but then this big diagonal line going through the image with those broken off sticks pointing down. They're kind of like spikes. Doesn't want you to climb on it. So here's a way to add a diagonal to, sort of ratchet it up a little bit instead of it being just this peaceful, quiet waterfall. Probably not necessarily dynamic, but having the center of that seaweed take that diagonal up through the image. It could have been shot straight on. It could have been shot many different ways. Another thing to think about when you're playing with diagonals is, where does the line terminate? Where does this seaweed stalk terminate in the frame? Is it here? Is it in the corner? Or is it above the corner? Right? Where is the best place to put that? Or maybe better yet, is it best to have it come to the corner or not? Because above or next to might mean might be another decision in terms of the angle of it. But it wouldn't be very, very difficult to turn this enough so that this stalk terminated in the corner. And I don't know what the answer is. I would say no as a rule, but if I did do it, there'd be a pretty good reason for it. Think about your camera angles. Right? We often take pictures at eye level. What happens when you give your camera to a kid? What happens when you get on a ladder? The world looks different. So think about, where you're shooting and how you're shooting. The angle of view, where you're shooting from. Sometimes shooting straight down at your feet can offer some really, really interesting compositions. This is a Point Lobos, and it's a little seaweed thing I was doing. Sometimes those can be very interesting. Here I'm laying on the ground with a wide angle lens a few inches away from that first piece of first bush. That dead bush there is not very tall. That hook is probably about 2 feet in the air, but it looks huge because I'm so close with a wide angle lens. So I'm getting some distortion from the lens, right? To have that hook sticking way up there in the air. Again, a wide angle lens looking up, getting some more roundness of those bumpers than really was there. There was some roundness, but I'm accentuating it with the wide angle lens. This is just looking straight up. Now, is it a great picture? I don't know. Probably not. But sometimes we don't look up. sometimes we don't look down. And a matter of fact, what I really like to say is that when I was younger, I went through this whole fly fishing thing. I wanted to grow up and be a professional fly fisherman. Probably make less money doing that than photography. So I wanted to be this professional fly fisherman. And I used to hang out at a place called the Mill Pond in Los Gatos, where all these old crusty, fly fishermen would hang out and tell fish stories. And I was 16, I'd ride my bike up there and I'd sit with them and talk with them and learn how to tie flies. And one of the old guys said to me, one thing you have to remember, Brian, is most young fishermen fish where they should be standing and stand where they should be fishing, or standing where they should be fishing. And I thought about that. I said, wow, that's an interesting question to ask yourself as you have your waders on and you're entering a stream. Where am I going to stand and where should I be fishing? And I think this applies to photography. Oftentimes I see people standing in the middle of the photograph. They're shooting something, but the photograph is right next to them where they're standing. It's right there. So be a little bit aware when you walk into a situation, right? Sort of look it over. Don't walk right into the middle of it. Walk around the outside a little bit and then move in a little closer. But just be careful that you're not standing where you should be photographing. And what you're photographing is where you should be standing. Excuse me. Well, all lines lead somewhere, so you should have them go somewhere in the frame that's important. If you have a diagonal, your eye is going to follow it. So when it goes, give a reward at the end. Don't just leave somebody hanging. I mean, I love this, right? On the way to Death Valley, no cars on the road, it's empty. Stop your car, lay on the ground, take a picture of the road. Where's the line going? Nowhere. It's to a mountain. There's nothing there. It's empty. Been great if there was a jet fighter in the sky or a row of motorcycles riding by or something to make this interesting. But that's about one of the most boring pictures I've ever seen. Right? The road going off to nowhere doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter at all. Or look at that line. Now that line of the path is being hit by the sun. That path is following the river. This is Salt Creek in Death Valley. We got a little pause where those people are standing, watching the sunset, and it continues on out of the frame, right, to the upper left. And you can imagine if you were down there, you'd be watching the sunset. The direction of light is coming right down through there. That beautiful wavy line, right, just kind of dancing through the photograph. Much more interesting picture. Because the line is interesting. It's going somewhere. It's got something to it. It's got a story. The family's going for a walk. They stop. They look at the sunset. So I get a lot of comments about this, especially from past students, about triangles. And I probably started talking about triangles a little bit too literally. And so what I really want you to think about is, you've probably heard that in a composition, you don't want 2 objects, you want 3. You don't want 4, you want 5. So it's kind of like the triangle. How many sides does the triangle have? 3. Right? It's a powerful shape. When you have 3 elements in the photograph, and your eye goes between those 3, forming a triangle, it makes the photograph more interesting. If it's 2, it's just going back and forth. Right? If it's 4, it balances. If it's 5, then you're moving a little bit. But 3 gives you that simplistic movement of the eye, right? In a powerful, good composition. So they don't have to be literal triangles. They can be implied triangles. So I don't know who shot this photograph. I stole it from somewhere. Did the photographer tell these 3 nuns, okay, you stand here, and you stand there so I can take a photograph to make a triangle? No, absolutely not. The photographer probably was far away, saw that interesting walkway, saw these nuns coming up, and he waited. Waited until the moment where they were forming a little triangle or it looked interesting compared to the background, and he took the photograph, or she took the photograph. So it's not necessarily about always forcing the triangle, but when do you choose to take the picture? When is that decisive moment when you take the picture? When everything comes together in a composition. One of these things may be geometric shapes. I think this is just funny. How many triangles can you find in a photograph? You know, a lot. So anyways, I don't think this is a good photograph by any stretch. I just put it in here because it makes everybody laugh about how many triangles there are, and also, you know, the attire of the time. So lines may give you an emotional response. They may have an emotional quality to them. S-curves may be soothing and pleasing. Jagged lines may be explosive. Vertical lines, dignity. Horizontal lines, restful, serenity. Diagonal lines, lively, restless, active. So I'm not going to ask you what qualities does horizontal lines have and expect you to give me restful and serenity. That won't be on a test because that's unrealistic. Horizontal lines can mean a lot of things. These are just examples. Examples of words you can use when you're looking at photographs. If you see a bunch of jaggy lines, maybe you want to look at those lines and not say, wow, I like those jaggy lines. You may look at the photograph and say, wow, that's explosive. That just blows up in my mind when I look at that. Right? You may look at horizontal lines and say, wow, that's what I need in my dentist office. That's what I need in the hospital. When I walk by that, it makes me feel calm. Not lively, not restless. So think about what words you identify with certain aspects or lines or compositions in the photograph. And then use those words, because they actually mean something.